When the knock came, Xiao Yin was counting the cracks in the wall. There were 6 above the window frame, thin and jagged like lightning frozen mid-strike. She'd noticed them every morning for weeks, ever since the nausea started and the world narrowed to small, survivable things. Eat a little. Breathe through it. Don't think too far ahead. She was 3 months pregnant today. Exactly 3. The knock came again. Firm. Impatient. She didn't need to open the door to know who it was. She could hear him breathing on the other side, measured and controlled, the way it always was. As if emotion were something you trained out of yourself, like a weakness in your stance. Come in, she said. The door opened. Shenyu walked inside in his military uniform, shoulders straight, boots polished to a dull shine. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he shut the door carefully behind him, as if the conversation they were about to have needed to be contained. Xiao Yin's fingers tightened around the enamel mug in her hands. The tea had gone cold. You're home early, she said. Emicha. He stood there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the edge of the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and familiar. In her first life, this was where she would have started filling the space. Asking if he'd eaten, if work was hard, if he wanted soup. She waited instead. Shenyu finally lifted his head. His face was as handsome as ever, sharp lines, clean jaw, the kind of man who inspired trust just by standing still. That was what everyone said. A model officer. A good husband. If only they knew. There's something I need to discuss with you, he said. Her heart didn't race. That surprised her. She'd expected fear, anger, something sharp. Instead, there was only a dull pressure, like a bruise pressed too often. Go on. He frowned slightly, as if her calm response had knocked him off balance. You know my brother passed away last month. I know, she said. She'd attended the funeral. Stood 3 steps behind him. Watched another woman collapse into his arms, sobbing like the world had ended. That woman was Lin Shui. Shenyu exhaled. Shui is alone now. She's pregnant. Her parents are gone, and there's no one to take care of her. Xiao Yi nodded. That's tragic. He hesitated. She's not in good health. Of course she isn't, Xiao Yi thought. She never was whenever she needed something. And, Xiao Yi prompted. His brows knit together. I'm getting to it. She almost laughed. In her past life, this was the part where she'd started to panic. Where she'd clutched her stomach unconsciously, already sensing the shape of the knife before it was drawn. This time, she leaned back in her chair. I want a divorce. The words landed between them, clean and blunt. There it is. He continued quickly, as if afraid she might interrupt. It's temporary. Just on paper. Shui needs a stable identity for the child. People talk. You understand how it is. Xiao Yin stared at him, at the way he spoke as though this were a logistical issue like reallocating supplies. You want to divorce me, she said slowly, so you can marry your sister-in-law. Shenyu's jaw tightened. Don't phrase it like that. How should I phrase it? She asked softly. He rubbed his temple. Once she gives birth and her situation stabilizes, we'll remarry. Nothing between us will change. Nothing. The word echoed in her head, bitter and almost funny. In her first life, she had cried here. She'd begged. She'd asked him if he remembered their vows, the years they'd spent together, the child growing inside her. He had looked at her with impatience then, with disappointment. She remembered kneeling on this very floor, her pride ground down into something unrecognizable. She remembered how that refusal had cost her everything. So this time she smiled. All right, she said. The word hung in the air. Shenyu froze. What? I said all right. She took another sip of cold tea and made a face at the bitterness. I agree to the divorce. His eyes widened just a fraction. You agree? Yes. He searched her face, clearly expecting hysteria, accusations, tears. You don't have any conditions? I do, she said. Relief flickered through him. Name them. I want 500 yuan. Child support. He frowned. That's all. That's all. For a moment, he looked almost ashamed. Eni, you don't need to make things difficult. After all, we're still. Shenyu, she interrupted, using his full name for the first time in years. Let's keep this clean. Something in her tone shut him up. He nodded.
Fine.
I'll have the paperwork drawn up today. Good. He hesitated at the door, then turned back. His voice softened, just like it always did when he wanted something. I promise you, once Shui is settled, I'll come back for you. Xiao Yin met his gaze. In her past life, this promise had kept her alive just long enough to die more painfully. Now it meant nothing. She curved her lips into a small, cold smile. I'll be waiting. Shenyu visibly relaxed. He stepped forward, almost reaching for her hand, then thought better of it. Rest well, he said. You're still pregnant. Take care of yourself. The door closed behind him. The room fell silent. Xiao Yin sat there for a long time after that, her hand finally drifting to her stomach. Inside her, a life stirred, unaware of how close it had come to the edge. I won't make the same mistake again, she whispered. This time, she would survive. And this time, she would never look back. The Civil Affairs Bureau smelled like old paper and disinfectant. Xiao Yin noticed at the moment she stepped inside, the sharp, sterile tang cutting through her nausea. The hallway was crowded with people clutching documents, some arguing in hushed, furious voices, others standing stiffly apart like strangers waiting for a bus that might never come. Marriage, divorce, birth registrations, death certificates. All of life flattened into forms and stamps. She sat on the hard wooden bench and folded her hands over her belly. 3 months. Still small. Still easy to hide beneath her coat. Shunyu stood a few steps away, speaking quietly with the clerk. His posture was straight, his expression calm, like this was just another administrative task. Watching him like this, it was almost impossible to believe he was ending a marriage. In her first life, she had stared at his back with desperate hope, convinced that if she said the right thing, if she endured just a little more, he would turn around. This time, she counted breaths instead. The clerk called their names. Papers were slid across the desk. Ink pressed into pads. Signatures written. The scrape of pen against paper sounded unnaturally loud. When it was over, Xinyu picked up the documents and exhaled as if a weight had lifted from his chest. We're done, he said. Yes, Xiao Yin replied. He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. I'll transfer the money later today. I'll hold you to it. He nodded, then hesitated, as though expecting her to say something else. When she didn't, he turned and walked toward the exit. Xiao Yin followed at her own pace. The sunlight outside was harsh, bleaching the concrete steps and making her squint. She took one step down, then stopped. Lin Shui was standing beneath the ginkgo tree across the street. She wore a pale blue coat, the kind designed to make a woman look fragile and soft. Her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. One hand rested on her lower abdomen, fingers curved protectively, while the other clutched a handkerchief like a prop she knew how to use well. She had positioned herself perfectly. Anyone leaving the bureau would see her. Xinyu saw her immediately. Shuer, he called, striding toward her. Xiao Yin stayed where she was, her shadow stretching long across the steps. She didn't need to move closer to hear. I felt dizzy, Lin Shui said softly. I didn't know who else to wait for. Her voice trembled, just enough. Shunyu's face changed instantly. Concern softened his features, his shoulders angling toward her without conscious thought. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to bother you. She swayed. That was all it took. Xinyu caught her by the arm, pulling her close. You shouldn't be standing so long. Come on. I can walk, Lin Shui protested weakly, even as she leaned more of her weight against him. He didn't listen. He bent down and scooped her up, one arm under her knees, the other braced around her back. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the people nearby. Lin Shui let out a soft cry of surprise, then nestled against his chest. As he turned, her eyes lifted. They met Xiao Yin's. For just a second, the frailty vanished. Lin Shui smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't obvious. Just a slight curl of her lips, a glint of triumph that said, I win. Xiao Yin felt it then. Not pain. Not jealousy. Something colder. She watched them leave. Xunyu's stride hurried, protective, his attention fully consumed by the woman in his arms. She waited until they disappeared around the corner before descending the steps. The world felt oddly quiet after that, like a room after the door slammed shut. She walked home alone. The streets were familiar, every crack in the pavement memorized from years of walking them with groceries, with laundry, with dreams she hadn't known were already rotting. Vendors shouted. A bicycle bell rang. Somewhere, a radio played an off-key love song. Her hand drifted to her stomach again. In her first life, this was when she had started to suspect. Back then, she'd been stupidly late to the truth. Too trusting. Too busy believing in the shape of her marriage rather than its substance. She'd only realized it after Lin Shui died. After the abortion. After the blood. After Xinyu's grief twisted into something monstrous and needed a target. Marcus had loved Elise long before his brother's death. That truth had surfaced piece by piece, like bones rising through shallow soil. And the child Lin Shui carried had never been her brother-in-law's. It had been Xunyu's. Or maybe not only his. Xiao Yin stopped walking. Someone was standing near the alley beside her building. He leaned against the wall with one foot propped up, smoking lazily. His clothes were cheap, his hair slicked back too carefully, the kind of man who thought a smile could open any door if it was greasy enough. Her stomach tightened. Su Zhang. In her past life, he'd been nothing more than a passing acquaintance at first. A friend of a friend. A convenient witness. Later, he had been the man who swore under oath that he'd seen her sneaking into a hotel room with another man. The man whose testimony sent her to hell. She kept her expression neutral and walked past him.
Hey, he called.
Sister-in-law. She stopped. Slowly, she turned. Su Dong grinned, eyes flicking down to the folder tucked under her arm. The red stamp was unmistakable. Those divorce papers? He asked. Yes. He whistled. That was fast. Officer, Shinshore moves quick. She studied his face, the lazy confidence, the assumption that he already knew how this story would end. In her past life, she'd been afraid of him. Afraid of his rumors, his connections, his willingness to lie. Now, she saw him clearly. A dog chasing scraps. An idea took shape. You know Lin Shui, don't you? Xiao Yin asked.
Su Dongsheng Lin Widen.
Who doesn't? She told me something interesting, Xiao Yin said casually. About her past. Oh. She said you were very close. He puffed out his chest. That's one way to put it. Xiao Yin tilted her head. She didn't mention the others, though.
Su Dongflawen.
Others?
Yes. Tom.
He worked at the supply depot. Rick from the transport team. Leo, the married one who rented a room near the river.
She paused.
And Xinyu, of course. Su Dong's face drained of color. That's not funny, he said. I'm not joking. She met his gaze steadily. She said she doesn't even know who the father is anymore. The cigarette slipped from his fingers, scattering ash across his shoe. You're lying, he snapped. Why would I? Xiao Yin asked gently. I'm divorced now. None of this concerns me. His jaw clenched, veins standing out in his neck. She told me I was the only one. She tells everyone that, Xiao Yin said. It makes men feel special. Su Dong stared at her, anger and humiliation wrestling across his face. Finally, he spat on the ground. That bitch, he muttered. Xiao Yin stepped past him without another word. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her legs trembled, not from fear but from adrenaline. She leaned against the door once she was inside, listening for footsteps that didn't come. She exhaled slowly. The web was already tightening. Su Dong wasn't clever. He wasn't loyal. And he hated being made a fool of. She pressed her palm to her belly, feeling the faint warmth there. This time, she whispered, I'll let them destroy each other. Outside, somewhere down the street, a man shouted in rage. Xiao Yin closed her eyes and let herself smile. The door was unlocked. That was the first thing Xiao Yin noticed when she returned. She stood there for a moment, fingers still curled around the handle, listening. The familiar sounds of the house had changed. There was a soft cough from inside. The rustle of fabric. A voice that didn't belong to her. She stepped in. A pair of women's shoes sat neatly by the door. Pale leather, barely worn. Definitely not hers. Xiao Yin's own shoes were still shoved crookedly in the corner, dusted with a faint layer of gray. So it's already begun. She closed the door behind her, the click echoing louder than it should have. In the living room, Xinyu stood beside the table, his jacket draped over the back of a chair. Lin Shui was perched on the sofa, her posture delicate, one hand resting on her belly as though it might float away if she let go. Oh, Lin Shui said when she saw her, surprise flashing briefly across her face. You're back already? Xiao Yin didn't answer her. She looked at Xinyu instead. You moved her in, she said. He didn't deny it. It's more convenient. She needs care. This is my house. It was, he corrected, then softened his tone. Just for a few days. Until things settle. Xiao Yin nodded slowly. She felt oddly detached, like she was watching someone else's life play out. I see. Lin Shui shifted, wincing. Yuji, I feel a bit weak. He was at her side instantly. Lie down. I don't want to trouble you, Lin Shui murmured, already reaching for him. But my legs feel numb. Shunyu bent and lifted her again, as easily as he had outside the Civil Affairs Bureau. Xiao Yin watched them pass, his arms sure practiced. They disappeared into the bedroom. Her bedroom. She stood there alone, the air thick with a scent she didn't recognize. Something floral. Too sweet. When he came back out, his face was faintly flushed. Make some chicken soup, he said. She needs nourishment. Xiao Yin blinked. With what? He frowned. What do you mean? My money, she said. You want me to spend my money feeding your mistress? His expression hardened. Don't talk like that. Then don't act like this. He stared at her, clearly unused to resistance. It's just a chicken. Then buy one yourself. Silence stretched between them. Lin Shui coughed loudly from the bedroom. Xinyu exhaled sharply.
Fine.
How much? 500, Xiao Yin said.
He scoffed.
For a chicken? For the divorce, she replied evenly. You promised. His eyes darkened. You're threatening me? Yes. He laughed once, humorless. With what? With the truth, she said. About how long you and Lin Shui have been together. About whose child she's carrying. I think your unit would be very interested. The color drained from his face. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded stack of bills, and slapped it onto the table. Take it.
She did.
From the doorway, Lin Shui watched, her earlier fragility gone. So that's how it is, Lin Shui said, stepping out slowly. You're squeezing him for money now? Xiao Yin met her gaze. I'm collecting what I'm owed. Lin Shui laughed softly. You're pathetic. Clinging to scraps. Am I? Xiao Yin asked. Lin Shui stepped closer, voice lowering. Do you know when Yu Ji first touched me?
Shen Yu snapped, Xue.
On my wedding night, Lin Shui said, eyes gleaming. While my husband was passed out drunk. Xiao Yin felt something inside her go very still. He said you were boring, Lin Shui continued. Too obedient. Too dull. Xiao Yin smiled faintly. And yet he still married me. Lin Shui's face twisted. Enjoy it while you can. He won't let your child be born. The words slid into Xiao Yin's chest like ice. She looked at Shen Yu. He didn't deny it. That was enough. Xiao Yin folded the money carefully and slipped it into her pocket. I'll move out, she said. Soon. Lin Shui smirked. Good. As Xiao Yin turned toward the door, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. They had already decided her fate once. This time, she would write the ending herself. Mrs. Shen arrived just before dusk. Xiao Yin heard her before she saw her. The sharp tap of shoes against concrete, the familiar rhythm of a woman who had spent her entire life convinced the world owed her obedience. The door flew open without knocking. So you're still here? Mrs. Shen stood in the doorway, lips pursed, eyes scanning the room like she was inspecting stolen property. Her hair was pulled tight into a bun, not a strand out of place. Grief for her dead son had not softened her. If anything, it had made her sharper, more vindictive. This is my house, Xiao Yin said calmly. Why wouldn't I be? Mrs. Shen snorted. Don't be ridiculous. Once the divorce is finalized, you'll be gone. It already is. That gave the older woman pause.
What?
We signed today. Mrs. Shen's eyes lit up, then immediately narrowed. And the money? Xiao Yin raised a brow. What money? The 500 Shen Yu gave you, Mrs.
Shen said, stepping inside.
Shuer needs it for medical expenses. Xiao Yin almost laughed. That's my child support. You're divorced, Mrs. Shen snapped. What child support? The one growing inside me. Mrs. Shen's gaze dropped to her stomach, disgust flashing across her face. That thing? Don't flatter yourself. Xiao Yin's smile faded. Leave. Mrs. Shen's face twisted with rage. You dare speak to me like that? You're no longer my mother-in-law, Xiao Yin replied. And you're not getting a cent. Mrs. Shen raised her hand. Xiao Yin didn't flinch. The slap never came. Mrs. Shen seemed to remember herself at the last second, lowering her arm with a sharp huff. Fine, she said coldly. Let's see how long you last. She turned and stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. Xiao Yin stood very still. In her first life, this was where the fear would have crept in. Where she'd pace the floor, wondering what they would do next, imagining half-formed threats until sleep became impossible. This time, clarity settled over her instead. They wouldn't let her leave cleanly. They never had. She waited. Sure enough, voices drifted in through the thin wall an hour later. The bedroom door was open. Shen Yu's voice was low, urgent. Lin Shui's softer, threaded with false tears. Mrs. Shen's sharp and commanding. Xiao Yin pressed herself closer to the wall. She won't give the money, Mrs. Shen said. Ungrateful little bitch. She's getting difficult, Shen Yu replied. But it's fine. She'll leave soon. No, Lin Shui said quietly. She won't. Silence followed. She knows too much, Lin Shui continued. If she talks, everything collapses. Mrs. Shen scoffed. Then don't let her talk. Shen Yu hesitated. What are you suggesting? The same thing as before, Mrs. Shen said. Make her dirty. Make her disappear. Xiao Yin's pulse remained steady. Lin Shui spoke again, almost shy. I know someone.
Su Zhang.
He owes me. There it was. The plan unfolded easily after that, as familiar as a script she'd once memorized with her blood. Drug the soup. Let Su Dong into the room. Call the neighbors. Catch her in the act. Adultery. Disgrace. Labor camp.
Death.
Xiao Yin closed her eyes. Not this time. When the voices faded, she moved. First, she went to the kitchen. Mrs. Shen was there, clattering pots louder than necessary, muttering under her breath. Xiao Yin approached quietly, then spoke. You raised a good son. Mrs. Shen froze. What did you say? A good son, Xiao Yin repeated. Sleeping with his brother's wife. Plotting against his pregnant ex-wife. You must be so proud. Mrs. Shen spun around and lunged. Xiao Yin stepped aside. The older woman lost her balance, slammed face first into the counter. There was a sickening crack. She screamed. Blood poured from her mouth. 2 teeth clattered into the sink. Chaos erupted. Lin Shui shrieked. Shen Yu rushed in. Mrs. Shen collapsed onto a chair, wailing about assault and murder. I'll call the clinic, Shen Yu said urgently. Tell everyone, Mrs. Shen sobbed. Tell them what she did to me. They left in a rush, Lin Shui leaning heavily on Shen Yu, Mrs. Shen clutching her bloody mouth and moaning dramatically as they staggered out. The door slammed shut. The house fell silent. Xiao Yin wiped her hands on a cloth and went to the bedroom. Lin Shui's room. The scent there was stronger, cloying. On the bedside table sat a small paper packet. White powder. Xiao Yin picked it up, sniffed it lightly. Bitter. She replaced it with flour from the kitchen. Then she poured a glass of milk, stirred the real powder in carefully, and set it back where Lin Shui would reach for it without thinking. Her hands were steady. She returned to her room and waited. That night, Shen Yu brought her a bowl of brown sugar egg soup. Drink, he said, smiling.
She did.
It tasted sweet. Harmless. He watched until the bowl was empty, then left satisfied. The lock clicked. Minutes passed. Then footsteps. The door creaked open. Su Dong slipped inside, breath heavy, eyes glittering. Xiao Yin stood in the darkness, brick raised. This time, she was ready. The room was dark enough that shapes blurred into shadows. Xiao Yin stood just inside the door, her back pressed to the wall, breath slow and even. The brick in her hand felt rough, grounding. She had wrapped it earlier in an old cloth to dull the sound, the way she remembered doing in her first life, except then it had been instinctive and desperate. Now it was planned. The door creaked open again, wider this time. Su Dong slipped inside, closing it behind him with exaggerated care. He reeked of cheap cigarettes and alcohol, a sour, familiar stench that made her stomach tighten. His shoes scuffed softly against the floor as he took a few steps forward. Xiao Yin, he whispered. No answer. He chuckled under his breath. Playing hard to get. He moved closer to the bed. She could just make out the outline of his shoulders, hunched forward, confident. He thought he was the hunter here. Thought this night would end the way Lin Shui promised it would. When he reached the edge of the bed, Xiao Yin moved. She swung with everything she had. The brick connected with a dull, meaty thud. Su Dong didn't even have time to shout. His body crumpled sideways, collapsing onto the floor like a sack of grain. Xiao Yin stood there for a heartbeat, listening. Nothing. No movement.
No groan.
She crouched and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse. Strong enough.
Good.
She dragged him by the collar, muscles burning, every scrape of his body across the floor echoing too loudly in her ears. Sweat trickled down her spine despite the cold. She paused twice, steadying herself, whispering reminders under her breath. You're alive. You're in control. Outside, the night was thick and quiet. She hauled him toward the latrine, the stench growing stronger with every step. When she tipped him inside and let his body slump against the wall, relief washed over her so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. She closed the door and slid the bolt. Then she went back inside. The house had changed. Muffled sounds drifted from Lin Shui's room. Soft, breathless noises at first, then sharper ones. A woman's voice, slurred and needy. A man's low groan. Xiao Yin stood in the hallway listening. In her first life, this was the part she never got to see. She picked up the rolling pin from the kitchen, testing its weight in her hand. Smooth wood.
Solid.
The front door burst open. Everyone, come quickly. Mrs. Shen's voice rang out, shrill with false hysteria. She's disgraced our family. Footsteps flooded the house. Neighbors. Curious onlookers. People who'd always watched her with quiet judgment. Mrs. Shen marched straight toward Xiao Yin's room and threw open the door. Look, she shrieked. There was nothing. Just a crate under a blanket. What? Someone murmured. At that exact moment, Xiao Yin screamed. Not from her room. From Lin Shui's. The sound sliced through the house, raw and furious. What's that? Someone shouted. Xiao Yin flung open the bedroom door. Inside, Shen Yu was naked from the waist down, tangled with Lin Shui on the bed. Her clothes were half torn, her hair wild. The drug had dulled her senses, but not enough to save her from this moment. Xiao Yin charged forward and brought the rolling pin down.
Once. Twice.
Shen Yu screamed, scrambling back, trying to cover himself. Blood splattered across the sheets. "She's crazy," he shouted. "You were in my house," Xiao Yin screamed back, voice breaking perfectly. "In my bed." The neighbors surged forward, gasping, shouting over one another. Someone pulled Lin Shui off the bed. Someone else tried to cover Shen Yu. Mrs. Shen collapsed against the doorframe, shrieking like she'd been stabbed. Xiao Yin stood there, chest heaving, rolling pins slick in her hands, eyes wild. She knew exactly how she looked. And that was the point. This time, she wasn't the one being caught. This time, everyone saw them instead. The house erupted. Voices collided, rising and overlapping until they blurred into noise. Someone shouted Shen Yu's name. Someone else cursed. A woman screamed that she'd known it all along. The air felt too thick to breathe. Xiao Yin staggered backward, as if the strength had suddenly drained out of her. Her foot caught on the edge of the bed. She fell hard. The pain shot up her spine, sharp and immediate, but she barely had time to register it before something warmer followed. A slow, creeping heat spread beneath her, soaking through the thin fabric of her pants. She froze.
No, not yet.
Then Mrs. Shen lunged. "You little slut," the older woman shrieked, shoving Xiao Yin with both hands. "You planned this. You wanted to ruin him." Xiao Yin hit the floor again. This time, the pain in her abdomen was unmistakable. A deep, tearing sensation that stole the air from her lungs. She cried out, the sound raw and involuntary, her hands flying to her stomach. "It hurts," she gasped. "My stomach, it hurts," someone screamed. "There's blood." The word rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Xiao Yin curled inward, shaking, tears streaming down her face. Her body knew how to perform this grief. It remembered it too well. But beneath the sobbing, beneath the shaking, her mind stayed frighteningly clear. "You chose this." The neighbors surged forward, panic replacing outrage. Someone grabbed a coat. Someone else yelled for a stretcher. Mrs. Shen stood frozen, staring at the blood spreading across the floor, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Shen Yu pushed through the crowd, his face pale, his movements frantic. "Yin," he said hoarsely. "Yin, hold on." She looked up at him. For a moment, something almost like guilt flickered in his eyes. "Almost." "Doctor," someone shouted. "Call a doctor." They carried her out on an improvised stretcher, the night air slapping her skin awake. The streetlights blurred overhead as they rushed her toward the clinic. Xiao Yin clenched her jaw, letting her body shake, letting the pain show. Inside her coat pocket, the empty medicine packet crinkled faintly. She'd taken it hours ago, measured carefully, just enough. The confrontation was never a question of if, only when. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and fear. They laid her on a narrow bed. A nurse peeled away the blood-soaked fabric, her face tightening. "We need to act fast." Xiao Yin turned her head to the side. This child would not be born into chains. An hour later, the doctor came out, his expression grave. The pregnancy couldn't be saved. Shen Yu swayed like he'd been struck. "Mrs. Shen wailed. Lin Shui wasn't there. She couldn't be. Not yet." Down the hall, behind a different set of doors, doctors shouted orders. Curtains were drawn hastily. Metal clanged. The smell of sweat and panic seeped into the air. Shen Yu and Lin Shui were still trapped together. No amount of cold water or shouting had separated them. The sedative had turned embarrassment into a medical emergency. People whispered. By morning, the story had spread through the entire district. Xiao Yin lay pale and still in her bed, staring at the ceiling. When the nurse wasn't looking, she turned her head and allowed herself one silent breath of relief. It was done. Later that afternoon, she asked for paper. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate, her handwriting steady despite the weakness in her limbs. She detailed Shen Yu's conduct, the affair, the abuse of authority, the moral violations. She sealed the complaint with her fingerprint. "Please deliver this," she told the nurse quietly. "To his unit." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Elsewhere in the hospital, Su Dong's family arrived. They found him hours later, dumped in the latrine like refuse. His head was bandaged poorly. One eye was swollen shut. When he woke, pain tearing through him, rage followed close behind. "It was Lin Shui," he croaked. "She set me up." By nightfall, the walls were closing in. Xiao Yin closed her eyes. For the first time since waking up in this life, she slept without dreaming. The Moore family came like a storm with no warning. They didn't shout at first. They didn't threaten. They walked into the hospital with faces carved from stone, eyes red and hollow, carrying the kind of fury that had fermented quietly and reached its most dangerous stage. Su Dong's older brother led them. He was a thick-necked man with calloused hands and a permanent scowl, the kind of person who'd grown up solving problems with his fists because no one had ever taught him another way. Behind him came their mother, her hair half undone, lips trembling as she muttered Su Dong's name over and over like a prayer that had already failed. They found Shinyu outside the examination room. He was sitting on a bench, his shirt wrinkled, one side of his face swollen and bruised where Qiao Yin's rolling pin had landed. He looked older than he had a week ago. Smaller somehow. Su Dong's brother stopped in front of him. "You," he said. Shinyu looked up. He barely had time to stand. The first punch knocked him backward into the wall. Bone cracked. Someone screamed. Nurses rushed forward, and then froze when the rest of the more men surged in behind their leader. "You ruined my brother," Su Dong's brother roared, striking him again. "You and that whore." Shinyu raised his arms, trying to shield his face, but fists came from every direction. His ribs took the brunt of it. One hit landed wrong, sharp and blinding, and something inside his chest gave way with a wet sound. He cried out. The sound only fueled them. Someone grabbed his hair and yanked his head back. Another punch smashed into his eye. There was a sickening pop, and the world on one side went dark. When they finally dragged him to the floor and left him there, gasping and bleeding, the corridor was silent except for his ragged breaths. Lin Shui tried to run. She was halfway down the stairs when they caught her. "Let go of me," she screamed, panic finally real. "This has nothing to do with me." Su Dong's mother slapped her so hard her head snapped sideways. "You lured my son," the older woman shrieked. "You promised him a future." Lin Shui fell, clutching her stomach, her voice turning shrill. "I'm pregnant." "Not anymore," Su Dong's brother said coldly. They didn't hold back. By the time hospital security arrived, Lin Shui was curled on the floor, blood pooling beneath her. Her screams had turned hoarse, then faded into weak, broken sounds that barely registered as human. Doctors rushed her into surgery. They worked for hours. When they came out, their faces told the story before their mouths did. The child was gone. So was her womb. By morning, the hospital corridors were thick with whispers. People avoided Shinyu's room. Nurses spoke in hushed tones. Visitors pointed discreetly. The military investigation moved faster than anyone expected. There were witnesses. There were records. There was a formal complaint stamped and fingerprinted by a woman who had lost everything and still stood upright. Shinyu didn't get a hearing. He got a notice. Expelled.
Discharged.
Stripped of rank and uniform. When he woke and heard the words, he laughed. It was a thin, broken sound that made the nurse step back instinctively. "Where's Shui?" he asked hoarsely. No one answered. When Xiao Yin was discharged 2 days later, the sun felt too bright. She walked slowly, her body still weak, her steps careful. The world looked the same. The street vendors. The children running past with sticky hands and loud laughter. Only the house had changed. Mrs. Shen was there, standing in the kitchen like she still belonged. Pots were on the stove. Her mouth was swollen, her speech slurred, but her eyes burned with the same old hatred. "You think you've won," she hissed when she saw Xiao Yin. "You think you can throw us away?" Xiao Yin didn't answer. She set her bag down. Then she moved. She grabbed Mrs. Shen by the arm and shoved her toward the door. The older woman screamed, flailing uselessly, her strength gone with her illusions of control. "You can't do this." Mrs. Shen shrieked. "This is my son's home." Xiao Yin shoved her again, hard enough that she stumbled out onto the steps. "This house belonged to my parents," Xiao Yin said calmly. "You never owned a single brick." The neighbors gathered, drawn by the noise. Someone called the police. When they arrived, Xiao Yin handed over the deed. The officers glanced at it, then at Mrs. Shen, whose face twisted in disbelief. "This is private property," one officer said. "You'll need to leave." Mrs. Shen stood there, shaking, her world finally collapsing under the weight of reality. She turned and limped away. Xiao Yin closed the door behind her. For the first time in both lives, the house was quiet. And this time, the silence belonged to her. Xiao Yin didn't leave in a hurry. That surprised even her. In her first life, escape had been frantic.
Desperate.
She'd always been running from something, fear snapping at her heels, never quite fast enough. This time, she moved with a calm that felt almost unnatural, as if some invisible hand had finally steadied her spine. She stayed long enough to sell the house. People whispered when they saw her walking in and out, keys in hand, measuring rooms that had once swallowed her whole. The price she accepted was low.
Too low, some said.
But she didn't argue. Money could be earned again. Time, sanity, breath in her lungs. Those were rarer. The buyer didn't ask questions.
Neither did she.
She resigned from her job the same afternoon. Her supervisor stared at her paperwork, startled. "You're leaving just like that?" "Yes." "Where will you go?" She thought about it for a moment. South. That was all. The word tasted like warmth. She packed only what she needed.
Clothes.
Documents. The little notebook she'd filled during sleepless nights in the hospital, pages of numbers and half-formed plans scribbled between grief and clarity. Everything else she left behind. The chipped bowls. The wedding photo tucked in the bottom drawer. The past had had enough of her blood. On the morning she left, the sky was pale and open. The train station was crowded, thick with the smell of oil and dust and human impatience. Xiao Yin stood among them with a single suitcase and a cloth bag slung over her shoulder. When the ticket seller slid her destination across the counter, she stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Shenzhen. The word felt unreal. The train lurched into motion, metal screaming softly as it pulled away. Xiao Yin pressed her forehead to the window and watched the familiar streets slide backward, shrinking, dissolving into something distant and unimportant. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. By the time she arrived, the air was different. It was warmer, heavier, buzzing with noise and movement. The city felt alive in a way she wasn't used to. Construction dust clung to everything. Vendors shouted prices. Buses groaned. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly, unafraid. Xiao Yin breathed it in. She rented a narrow room above a shop near the market. The walls were thin, the bed narrow, the fan unreliable. But when she lay down that first night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, she felt something loosen inside her chest. No one here knew her. No one here could touch her. She started with a stall. Just a folding table at first, borrowed capital counted and recounted until the numbers blurred. She sold women's blouses, cheap but clean, colors chosen carefully after hours of watching what people lingered over. She worked from dawn until the lights flickered on at night, her feet aching, fingers sore from folding and unfolding fabric. She learned quickly which suppliers lied, which customers bargained just for sport, which smiles meant business, and which meant trouble. She learned how to stand her ground without hardening her heart, how to calculate profit while still leaving room for kindness. Some nights, exhaustion hit her so hard she couldn't lift her arms. On those nights, she reminded herself why she was here. She moved from stall to stall, then into a small storefront. She painted the walls herself, hung the sign crooked, and fixed it twice. The first time she locked the door at night and realized the key in her hand was hers alone, she stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. This is mine. Business grew slowly, then faster. She hired help, trained them patiently, paid on time. People noticed. Customers returned. Suppliers stopped trying to cheat her when they realized she remembered everything. Years passed without ceremony. 3 of them. Her hair grew longer. Her shoulders straightened. The shadows under her eyes faded. She learned how to laugh again, surprised by the sound when it came out of her own mouth. Sometimes late at night, the past still crept in. She dreamed of blood on tile, of locked doors, of Shunyu's face twisted with rage and disbelief. When that happened, she would wake, sit up, and remind herself where she was. The hum of the city outside her window grounded her.
Alive.
Moving, indifferent to her old pain. One afternoon, a familiar voice called her name. Xiao Yin. She turned. Mrs. Turner stood there, older, thinner, her hair streaked with gray. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then recognition dawned, and Mrs. Turner's eyes filled with tears. I thought I'd never see you again, she said. Xiao Yin smiled, genuine and warm. You came all this way? My son works nearby, Mrs.
Turner said.
I saw your shop sign and thought it couldn't be. They sat down to eat together later, steam rising from simple bowls of noodles. Mrs. Turner watched her with something like awe. You look well, she said. Peace suits you. Xiao Yin nodded. It does. She didn't ask about the past. Not yet. Outside, the city surged on, bright and loud and unapologetically alive. Xiao Yin leaned back in her chair, sunlight warming her skin, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in either life. Hope. Not the fragile kind, the kind that stays. They lingered over lunch longer than planned. The noodle shop was small and crowded, steam fogging the windows, the clatter of bowls and chopsticks filling the space between words. Xiao Yin ate slowly, listening more than speaking. Mrs. Turner kept glancing at her, as if afraid she might vanish if she looked away too long. You really built all this yourself, Mrs. Turner said finally, nodding toward the street outside, where Xiao Yin's shop sign caught the light. Yes, Xiao Yin said. One step at a time. Mrs. Turner smiled, then sighed. You always were capable. I said it back then, but no one listened. Xiao Yin's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. There it was. The invisible door between now and then. They finished eating. Outside, the afternoon sun hung low, warm but not oppressive. Xiao Yin locked up the shop and suggested a walk. Mrs. Turner agreed, her steps slower than Xiao Yin remembered, her shoulders more stooped. They sat on a bench near the street market, the air buzzing with voices and bargaining. I heard what happened, Mrs. Turner said quietly. Xiao Yin didn't respond right away. He came back, Mrs. Turner continued. Shouldn't you, I mean? After everything. Xiao Yin looked straight ahead. Back where? To his hometown. The unit wouldn't take him. No one would. With his eye and his temper, she shook her head. Your mother-in-law went with him. Xiao Yin let out a slow breath. She could picture it easily. The cramped rural house. The neighbors who whispered just loud enough to be heard. The humiliation of being recognized, pitted, avoided. He changed, Mrs.
Turner said.
Or maybe he just stopped pretending. Xiao Yin's lips pressed together. He drank, Mrs. Turner went on.
A lot.
When he didn't drink, he fought. He blamed everyone.
Especially you. Of course he did.
He went looking for Lin Shui, Mrs. Turner said, voice dropping. Thought she'd stay loyal. Thought he was still someone to her. Xiao Yin finally turned to look at her. She didn't, Mrs.
Turner said.
She laughed at him. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. She told him the truth, Mrs. Turner continued. That the child she lost wasn't his. That Su Dong had been the father. Or maybe one of them. She said it hardly mattered. Xiao Yin closed her eyes. In her first life, she'd never known this part. She died believing Xin Yu loved Lin Shui enough to destroy everything else. The truth was smaller. Uglier. He tried to hit her, Mrs.
Turner said.
Couldn't even do that properly with one eye and broken ribs. Su Dong's family was there. They beat him again. Told him to get lost. Silence stretched between them. Somewhere nearby, a vendor laughed loudly, arguing over a price. Life, relentless and indifferent, moved on. What about Lin Shui? Xiao Yin asked. Mrs. Turner hesitated. She ended up at Su Dong's place.
No womb.
No child. Taking care of him after what happened to his head. She shook her head slowly. It wasn't kindness. The Moors made her do it. Xiao Yin pictured it. The woman who had once played fragile and untouchable now trapped in a narrow room, cleaning up after the man she'd manipulated, every day a reminder of choices she couldn't undo. She felt no satisfaction. Only distance. Mrs. Turner studied Xiao Yin's face. Does it still hurt? Xiao Yin thought about that. She thought about the woman she had been in her first life. The fear.